In the previous video in this series, I posed the challenge that we should try to put the total population from each of the cities onto the countries data grid. So if we look at what we had, this is the countries list, and we simply list the name of the countries. On the cities list, we have the population for each city within a particular country, and at the bottom of the data grid we show the total population for that particular country. The challenge was to put the total of this onto the countries data grid, and this is what I anticipate the answer should look like. I hinted in the previous video that I would probably be approaching this by looking at the stored procedure in SQL Server to get the data. And I also further hinted that we will need to look out for nulls to make sure that they are treated correctly and doesn't throw a spanner in the works. So let's have a look at the code. As always, open Visual Studio and select the Blazor Countries project. If we recall, the countries data grid is on the index page. So if we just have a look at that to remind ourselves, this is the code for the index page, and the data grid is getting the data source from countries. And if we look further down the code in the C#, we'll see that on initialization, the countries is populated by the countries service countries get all. And if we look at that, countries service get all, we will see that it uses the stored procedure countries get all. So let's have a look at that in SQL Server. I've got SQL Server open, and if we look at the stored procedure for countries get all and modify it, we'll see here this is the select statement that's returning the data. So we need to change that to include the population. Now I'm going to, I'm not exactly cheat, but the way I find it easier to do this is to build up the select statement in a graphical user interface. If you know the straight SQL, is easier to type it in here, but I just find it easier to use the graphical user interface. And by choosing views, we've got the advantage that we can actually run the SQL statement to see what happens. So let's have a look. We need countries and we need cities because that's where the populations are held. And what we want our stored procedure to return is the country ID, the country name, and the city population. And in here, if we just run that just to see what that will do, if we select this button up here, execute SQL, if I change the size of the windows so we can see the results, we can see that, for example, we've got all the countries listed out with population, but notice that, for example, we've got France twice because we've got two cities. So what we need to do here is on that join, we need to right click and we want to select all rows from countries, and we effectively want to group them. So the grouping tool is up here saying group, add group by, and so we want it grouped by country and name, but population we want a sum. And now if we run it, we can see that we're getting for each country, and we're getting, for example, where's France? France, we're now getting 9.5 million. But we've also got these nulls in here, and it's called EXPR1. Let's change that so that just says country population. And we need to do something about these nulls. The function that we need is called isNull. So what we want here is where the sum of the country, so the sum of the city's population is null, we want to replace that with 0. And there's a function called isNull that effectively, would help if I could spell it, that says if this is null, replace it with 0. Otherwise, we'll have the actual number there. So let's try that again. And we've got all the countries and we've got the populations. So that looks good. So this is the code that we want, and actually we'll also have it ordered by ordered by country name. That's what we had before, so it comes out naturally in alphabetical sequence. So this is the code we want. So all we need to do there is to copy that and paste it into the stored procedure for get all. So we just replace that section there with that code, and that should be all we need. Right, so I'll run that. So that's now changed the stored procedure. We don't need these other queries that I've got here, so they can go. So that's the stored procedure. Back in the C# code, we need to make a few changes. On the index.razor, where we have the grid, we need an additional column. So I'm just going to copy the one we've already got. Make a few changes. So we want that to be country population. Let's call it just population for the column heading. And we'll have it aligned right. And we'll format it with comma separated thousands, and we'll change the width to 30. Right, we've got country population there. That's because in the countries model, we haven't yet got country population. So we need to go to countries and add the country population. And I'm just going to put a note in here. So this is a calculated column. And we're only ever going to be getting it. We're never going to be writing to it, so we'll just leave that as get. Right, so I think we'll save those and see what it looks like. Yes, we've got the populations coming through. France is 9.5 million, but I forgot to put the total. Okay, so let's go back and do that. Now we've got the total on the cities page, so I'm just going to be lazy and copy and paste the total and then change it. So this comes grid aggregates, and it goes immediately underneath grid columns. And we want that to be countries, country population. And that should be that, I think. Right, give it another go. And it's wrapping it because I haven't given it enough space, I don't think. Yeah. Okay, so if I went back and changed the code here to change the, so that gave that 40 or 50, then I think we'd be okay. Right, that's it. I've said that I'm sure that's not the only solution. There are probably ways of actually putting the SQL code for that particular uh, extraction of the population in the C# code, but the SQL is the route I've chosen. Thank you very much. I hope you've had as much fun doing this as I have.